Hey. Hello everyone and welcome to Avid Reader and welcome to our very large Zoom audience that is piling in at the moment too. And I'd like to thank the people who are here in real life because this morning I wasn't quite sure that this event was going to be able to go ahead, and it's really exciting to be able to do this and also to be able to have you guys here with us tonight. So remember that because we've got the mask rules are here again. Basically, we will be able to take your mask off when you drink, but when you finish drinking, you'll have to pop your mask back on again, unfortunately. And of course, we'll have to put your mask back on when you head through the shop again. So they are the rules. And also the other bit of information for people here in the room is that there are toilets that are just out through that gate in the corners, little lit room, and they're the easiest toilets to get to. But if you're in the back rows, you can go through the shop and upstairs, and that's where the toilets are upstairs. Excellent. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. In this area, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also because we're on Zoom, we are zooming out onto the lands of many different Aboriginal people across Australia. I'd like to pay my deepest respects to elders of the people that we're zooming out to. This always will be Aboriginal land. It's very exciting to be hosting this in real life event here tonight, and such an important topic that we've been kind of skirting around for a while, listening to radio reports, seeing television reports about it, and now engaging in a more full way in a book. So I am personally very interested to listen in tonight, as I'm sure you all are. And to take us through the evening, we have the person who I would want to take us through such an important and sensitive topic, which is Professor Peter Greste, who is always amazing on these issues, and we welcome him here tonight. He is the UNESCO Chair of Journalism and Communications at UQ. Peter's an award-winning foreign correspondent who spent 25 years working for the BBC, Reuters and Al Jazeera in some of the world's most volatile places. Since his release from a prison in Cairo, where he was held for more than 400 days, he's become a vocal campaigner and advocate for media freedom, a stance that has earned him many awards, including a Walkley and the International Association of Press Club's Freedom of Speech Award. He's written about his experiences in Egypt in his book, The First Casualty, which is front and centre at the counter right beside rogue forces. So when you go out to check out rogue forces during the signing card of the evening, that is there as well. So a note for the people on Zoom: if you do want to join in the conversation by asking questions, you need to type them into the chat bar. And I think my trusty colleagues inside are just sending you a link to the book, sneakily sending you a link to the book, which will also show you where the chat bar is. You can type your questions at any time on that chat bar, and they will be texted to me out here, and I'll be able to ask them for you at the end. So without further ado, I am going to let you be in the capable hands of Peter Greste.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I wish I could say that it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mark Willacy this evening, but after reading his book, I can honestly say it's something I wish he didn't have to write. Mark is one of Australia's most decorated journalists, with 7 Walkley Awards to his name, including a Gold Walkley, which is the highest honour in Australian journalism. He's also a Logie Award for his Four Corners film on the Thai cave rescue, and he was twice named Queensland Journalist of the Year. He was the ABC's Middle East and North Asia correspondent before joining what I once might have described as the ABC's own Special Operations Group, the Investigations Unit. Although after reading Rogue Forces, I'm not sure that title, that analogy is going to quite be as acceptable as it once was. Rogue Forces is an extraordinary book. It's definitely not an Andy McNabb style story of daring do, of adventure, of heroism by one of the world's most elite special forces. It is an incredibly well-written book. It's also a book that's very difficult to put down. In a strange kind of way, there are times when I wish I could have put it down. Mark, it's great to have you here. This is a story that you've been involved with for quite a long time. I wonder, when you introduced the book, you made it clear that this is the story of one special air service group in 1 year and one rotation. But what you've uncovered with this story, with this book, and with your investigations, I think is a deeply, deeply troubling example, a troubling narrative of the way in which a group of Australian soldiers, the people who we hired to act in our names, went off the rails. I'm going to ask you to open this by reading what, for me, was one of the most harrowing passages in your book. It's the introduction to chapter 8, In Case of War, Break Glass. If I could just ask you just to read that section, that'd be great.
Thanks for having me, everyone. So this is the start of chapter 8. The patrol stands in a semicircle around the Afghan's body. They are silent. Soldier C has just emptied the man's skull. The 2 shots were perfect. Dusty reckons the man's brains hit the ground before he did. It is 2 months before Dad Muhammad's killing in the wheat field. They are standing in another field looking at the body of another Afghan killed by Soldier C. They will later remember this young man as the village idiot. Tom had seen Soldier C raise his rifle. Maybe he's just taking a sighting through his scope, he had thought. They do that all the time. But the Afghan was only about 20 metres away. Close. Why do you need your scope at this range? There was something not right about the young man, the way he looked, the way he limped away. He was disabled. He was scared shitless. Everyone could see it. Then pop, pop. His head exploded. Perfect shots. As they look down at the man's shattered head, the patrol commander tells his 2IC to dress the body in a battle bra chest rig containing rifle magazines. The man was unarmed, so they need to manufacture a reason for killing him. This isn't just the story of a killing. It is a story of a cover-up. They take photos of the dead man wearing the battle bra and the magazines. Move on, says the patrol commander. They move on. The Afghan with the emptied head is left in the field. They don't even know his name.
Mark, that's a very powerful, very compelling passage. What did you feel when you started to hear these kind of stories?
Look, I never really was involved in the story from the beginning. There are other journalists, great journalists in this country, Chris Masters, Nick McKenzie, Dan Oakes, Sam Clark, who had been involved in these stories, and I was basically seconded in to help out. And so I came late to this story, and I got a few lucky breaks. And that first lucky break was being contacted by a former SAS support staff member called Brereton Chapman. Although he emailed me anonymously, he gave me this amazing sort of moment where a journalist gets this email and it contains all this information. It's got names, it's got events and incidents in it. It's probably, you get an email like that 2 or 3 times in your journalistic career, and I eventually made contact back with Brereton. We agreed to meet, and so that spawned this series of stories. And after each story, more information would come in, more contacts would be established, and so I began to meet these SAS guys, support staff, and operators around the country. We'd meet in sometimes in bars. I met a guy in a regional city on a park bench with strict instructions. I met people in car parks, hotel rooms. Overall, I think in the end we spoke to over 150 people connected to the regiment. But the stories came from people who were very broken, and the one factor with all of them was that they were broken by what they saw and by what they were sort of compelled to be part of. These were good people who believed in the ethos of the Special Air Service Regiment, what it stood for, the ethics, its honour, its history. And what they were telling me was sort of hard to believe to begin with. And so whenever I'd get a story like that, story was the so-called village idiot killing. That's how it became known. amongst the people of the regiment, I'd asked for verification. That's what we do as journalists. So I met Dusty Miller, who was also there. I spoke to other people who were connected with that particular incident, and yeah, it was shocking. It was absolutely shocking, and we ran the story, and there's outrage for a day, and people move on. And I knew eventually that all of these stories that we were telling, the only way to really put it in a format where people could digest it, get context, get nuance, was in a book.
There's been a lot of criticism of the way of the work that you've been doing. We'll come to address some of the responses to this later, but I'm interested in learning a little bit more about the way that you investigated this. Obviously, it's very difficult for any white Western journalist to operate and to go investigate these kinds of stories inside Afghanistan itself. Can you walk us through how you verified the kind of information that you got? How do we know that what you've been telling us is true?
Yeah, well, obviously, we've just talked about the Australian side of it. So that's the SAS. What I was being told by elements of the regiment, both the operators, the support staff, some officers. The one really important aspect of the Afghan war that wasn't often being told or being dismissed was the Afghan side of it. So it was very important that rather than just run, so when I got the videos, let's just talk about these videos that I got. And there was all this amazing stuff on it, which culminated, of course, in the killing in the wheat field that we ran on Four Corners. We could have just ran that story like that. Oh, wow, this looks a bit sus. Wow, look at that, terrible. But we made it very clear that within our group that we wanted to investigate. Where was it? Who was it? What patrol? When? And so that took Afghans. And this is one of the great things, and I hope I pay tribute enough in the book to these people, were the Afghan journalists that we employed. Now, I've been to Afghanistan. It wasn't part of my Middle East patch when I was there for 4 years. That ended in Iran. So I didn't get there much. I only went in there when I had to go in there to help out. So I didn't know Afghanistan that well. It was very difficult for anyone to get into these areas of Afghanistan where we needed to go because the Taliban already controlled these areas. So we had to rely on these brave journalists. Now, it's very important as a journalist that you don't write the narrative for we call them fixers. They're really journalists. So, we had this particular killing. I knew the village. I got hold of my journalist and I said, I need you to go to that village. Is it safe? I want you to go and ask around for something that happened in March 2012. I want you to find out, was there a killing there? Who did it involve? Get me some names. And so we dispatched the journalist and he, a few weeks later, we get something back. In the meantime, back here in Australia, I've confirmed through other sources close to the military who that victim was. I've also confirmed circumstances with guys who were on the ground. So what I'm trying to do is match that information with the information I'm getting back from Afghanistan. And I want that information back from Afghanistan. I want it unfiltered. I don't want it corrupted or polluted. And so the journalists would send them out and they'd come back with this information. And I have to say, despite the rubbish that I was getting from people about, you can't trust Afghans, they're all Taliban or, they're just seeking money, which was a pretty predominant attitude. I was getting consistent stories. Interviews were done separately with people, whether they were family members or witnesses to particular issues or incidents. And so it was very important that we didn't pollute that evidence gathering from that end and that what we gathered matched what we found at the Australian end. And that's why it took so much work. But without those Afghan journalists, we didn't have the full story. So when that Four Corners went to air, we had the video, we had the date, we had the village, we had the name of the victim, we had the father of the victim, and then we had the Australian Defence Force documents proving that they basically covered this up. So it wasn't just a story of a video. And that's really important. And that's what journalism is, investigative journalism that we do.
And so what emerged from that story? I mean, we know of the accounts, we know anyone who saw the Four Corners film, the killing fields, I don't think anyone who saw that can possibly forget what they saw, what was contained in that video. But it wasn't just a series of isolated incidents, was it? What was it that emerged from those stories?
Well, I suppose I'd answer it by saying the reason I wrote the book the way I did was I wanted to establish a systemic series of, basic failures of, I suppose, standards and ethics. But I wanted to do it through one patrol, in one squadron, in one deployment. And I wanted the reader to understand that there are mainly good people here who they couldn't say anything. This is the one thing that people say to me, why didn't people speak out? Why didn't people raise their hands? Well, some people did, and it didn't go well for them. And I pulled out a quote today preparing for this. This is Tom, like he was on that patrol where the village idiot is killed, and he saw it happen, and he said, I genuinely believe that if they'd had the opportunity, if we'd raised certain things, that they had the capability to put a bullet in the back of your head and just turn around and say it was the Taliban. That comes from a guy who did 3 tours of Afghanistan, who was a very well-respected SAS operator, who was fearful because he stood up and he raised issues. Now, that systemic issue comes from that quote. These people were allowed to get away with it, these few, but these few polluted the many, and that broke a lot of people.
One of the stories in the book, and we spoke about this earlier, one of the stories that I find particularly harrowing was what became known as the tractor job. This was, I think, one of the highest casualties, highest death tolls of civilians in any Australian operation. 13 people were killed, I think at least 11 of those.
Yeah, it's disputed. It's 9 to 11.
9 to 11 civilians. Can you just talk us through what happened in the tractor job?
Yeah, it was in December 2012, what they call a winter rotation. Now, winter in Afghanistan, the fighting tends to die off a bit. However, on this day, the SAS had a target. They launched several helicopters, Black Hawks, to this particular village in northern Kandahar. As they come into land, a couple of the Black Hawks come in to where the target area is. There is no Taliban there, there's no doubt about that. As they come into land, a tractor is seen scurrying off. So the second Black Hawk, containing what's called Zulu 1 patrol, is ordered to get back up and go after what they call the squirters. So they do that, and they follow that particular tractor and basically come down near the tractor. Now, I spoke to people who were there, and it became a frenzy. So the patrol commander gets off the helicopter and he shoots one Afghan by the tractor. These guys on the tractor, they were loading onions at the time when the helicopters came in. Then another trooper opens fire, and a third trooper, and eventually a child, by two sources have told me that a young boy, well, not a young boy, he was a teenager, about 13 or 14, was cowering behind the tractor wheel when he was shot by Soldier C. Now, Soldier C crops up in the book. He was the soldier, the trooper who was in the field in the Four Corners, who killed the Afghan who was on the ground. Now, what happens then is, and this was an extraordinary thing for the book and for the story, is that he goes back and there's a lot of agitation about what had happened. And he happens to talk to an intelligence officer, a captain who was back at base, and that captain is actually his ex-wife. They divorced the year before, and he tells her, and she's quoted in the book, as saying that, one guy opened fire and they didn't want to leave any witnesses. That's her words. And so all of these people were killed, including this 13-year-old boy. And she's, as you'd imagine, she stumbles out of the ready room, as it's called, into the night air, and she's a bit shocked. She's blown away by what she's just heard. And so she checks the imagery. They bring back photos of people who have been killed in operations, and there she sees what she believes is a young boy, 13 or 14. And she decides not to say anything. She decides just to tell her immediate supervisor, and it doesn't go anywhere. So that was in 2012, and it wasn't until she saw the Four Corners in March 2020, and she saw her ex-husband involved in another alleged unlawful killing in a field, that she thought, I've got to do something about this. So this conscience is jarred by that footballer's episode.
One of the things that you repeatedly talk about, excuse me, one of the things that comes up a lot in the book is the question of moral injury to people like Soldier C's ex-wife, to others who were a part of the patrols who might have objected to what they saw but felt powerless to respond. Can you talk to us a bit about what that moral injury was the impact of that moral injury on those people?
Well, yeah, pretty well all the main characters in the book, and at the end of the book, I sort of sum up, it's a where are they now section. They've all come home. It's many years, about 8 years after Afghanistan, and pretty well all of them are suffering. And these people didn't kill unlawfully. They weren't involved in what the Brereton report found. They were bystanders. Sometimes they were compelled to help with the cover-ups, but a lot of them have been diagnosed with what's called moral injury, and it's something that philosophers and psychiatrists and psychologists are really just learning about. And I spoke to Dusty Miller, who was the SAS medic on that particular tour, and Dusty's in the book in this particularly notorious incident where an older Afghan is shot through the meaty part of his thigh, and Dusty's brought in to basically patch him up. And Dusty said what's called a through and through injury, didn't really even need a tourniquet, was patching him up, was going to take him back to the base, and he was going to get a little bit more medical treatment when one of the senior sergeants basically comes, grabs the guy and says, I'm taking him. And he takes the guy into the village mosque, which is really only a room. And he comes out a while later and he said the guy didn't make it. And Dusty said, well, what do you mean? He just said, the guy didn't make it, and that's it, no more discussion. And the guy is later found with what the Afghans and the Afghan Human Rights Commission alleges was boot marks on his chest. So Dusty felt really bad because as an SAS medic, that patient is his responsibility. So he came home and he fell off the rails for a while and talked openly about drinking and, basically being suicidal. And he talked about this moral injury, and I asked him sort of to describe it. He said, it's anguish. That's what it is, a constant anguish about you being involved in wrongdoing or not doing the right thing. That moral decision was taken away from you. And another one of the characters, Christina, she said, I don't know the last time I was happy. I don't get excited by things, or I don't feel happy or joyous. There's grief that I'm not going to get that back. I don't think it's ever going to come back. It's gone forever. So that idea that you can't feel joy and that you've had that moral decision taken away from you, and it's something that all of them repeated to me that they suffer from.
But Mark, one of the things that you've been criticised for is targeting or aiming your fire, your journalistic fire, on SAS soldiers who were acting in the heat of battle. People who are operating in an incredibly difficult, complex environment, incredibly violent environment where they're under threat themselves, they're frequently shot at, where people are trying to kill them. An environment that you and I, even though we've both worked in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and most of the readers couldn't possibly understand because of the very unique, specific nature of their work, and that you're targeting them for doing their jobs, for the jobs that we've trained them for. How do you respond to that?
I suppose I respond to that by quoting one of the SAS guys I spoke to about that issue. I said exactly what you said to me. I said, surely this is, fog of war, heat of battle. And he says, bullshit. We are trained not only to pull the trigger, but we're not to pull the trigger. They spend $1.7 million, I think he said at the time, on training us. We are the best. We should be proud of, not having to pull the trigger or not crossing those lines. And again, the vast majority didn't. That's the thing. And that's the thing that annoys me about this whole debate and media campaigns is the idea that, we're going after the regiment or we're going after the commandos, or we're going after this and that. No, we're just looking at certain incidents where it's not heat of battle, where it involves, they could have been Taliban, but they're out of the fight. They're now detainees or pucks, as they're called, or they're people who were never in the fight, or it's not the heat of battle. There is nothing going on. There's incidents in the book where people are dragged away. One guy's dragged away into a stable and shot. you know, I do believe in heat of battle, decisions have to be made. They have to be made in a split second. And if innocent people die in those heat of battle things, well, that might be the sad thing of war, but these aren't those incidents. And I do get this, you wouldn't know what it's like. I lived in Jerusalem and Baghdad for 4 years in 2002 to 2006. You know, I went to 23 suicide bombings. I had guns put to my head in Baghdad. I had the American Marines pull me out of a car thinking my cameraman had an RPG. And I'm not a soldier. I don't know what it's like. But I know how confusing it is. These were not confusing situations.
So how did it happen? I mean, as you said, these are the highest, the most, the elite soldiers, not just within the Australian Defence Forces, but amongst the world. They are incredibly highly trained. They are supposed to be disciplined. They're supposed to be ethical. You've spoken to a lot of people. You've spoken to some of the people who've been accused of the war crimes themselves. You've had some very deep, long conversations with them. Can you understand how this situation came to be?
Look, I think a lack of leadership is largely to blame. I think, and that lack of leadership led to all sorts of problems, cultural problems. It led to issues where certain people within the regiment gained power. And there's no doubt, talking to SAS operators who were in the regiment for years and did multiple tours, that certain dominant individuals, and they were generally sergeants, so these are the people who lead the patrols.
Could you just explain how that works? Because the power structures, I think, within the patrols is really interesting, a little bit unconventional.
Yeah, so within the SAS, it's a little bit different to some other units. Basically, a lot of the time when the SAS goes in after a target or in on an operation, the highest ranking person on the ground is the sergeant, which is the patrol commander. You know, there is a captain, but he's normally dropped up in an overwatch position, generally, not always. So the highest ranking person is a sergeant. Now, those sergeants, they've done lots and lots of tours. They're mostly good soldiers. They're fine leaders, and they're battle hardened. Now, these are the guys you look, if you're a young soldier, you look up to that sergeant. Unfortunately, with a few of them across, you know, various squadrons, they became the dominant influence. And even the junior officers, the captains and above, the majors, deferred to these guys because, you know, well, they've done the hard fighting, right? But there was an incident, I talk about it in the book, and I think it really sums up just how dominant these sergeants, these corrosive sergeants became, where every year the regiment gets together in what they call the Stirrers Parade, and you know, they have fun, they have skits, they play rugby, and they started this, many years ago, they started this award called the Cock of the Year Award. And it became very toxic. And one year they decided to give it to this major who in Afghanistan had tried to push back against the sergeants, against the drinking that was going on over there. And so he made a bit of a, you know, pain of himself, this major. So back in Perth, they're having their annual Stirrers Parade. The sergeants get the major up and they say, "You're the Cock of the Year." And all the brass are in the crowd, including some generals, or a couple of generals, and they all laugh and clap. And this major is basically totally destroyed.
Because that undermines his authority completely.
And it also says to everyone else, all the junior fellas in the crowd, the sergeants are the power here. This is what happens if you rock the boat. Now, that is not a battlefield incident. It's not an alleged unlawful killing. That's just happening, you know, back home in Perth. But it was belittling. And I think a year later, the major left.
And as you describe in the book, a lot of the people who felt really deeply, deeply troubled by what they saw on those patrols felt not just unable to comment because it would risk their own careers, but felt in real danger.
Yeah, again, like that quote I read before about Tom in the book, and you know, he comes back from the village idiot killing, and they go into what they call their hot wash, and it's their debrief with the patrol commander, and the patrol commander says, "Congratulations to Soldier C for killing a high-value target." Dusty Miller's not in the debrief because he's only a support staffer, but this is ridiculous. So Tom makes the decision to get up and walk out. Now, you don't do that. Like, he's just a trooper, but basically a private. And he walks out, and from that moment on, just that act, that's the end of him. He gets thrown out of the patrol, and one night after they've had a fair few drinks, he's king hit from behind by one of his comrades and ends up slamming his head on the ground, and and that's what happens if you show any level of dissent within certain patrols. Other patrols will run perfectly, don't get me wrong. We've got to emphasise that there was only that minority toxic sort of element.
We'll come to that in a moment, but you've spoken about the failure of leadership. At one level, I suppose it makes perfect sense. You can see how that operates. But in practical terms, what are we to understand by that? How far up does that failure of leadership go? Do we blame, chief of the defence forces? Do we blame the senior officers within the special forces? How far up do you kind of have to tackle this problem?
I think you go right up the chain, at least to the top of the special operations commander at that point. I talked to a variety of people. Andrew Hastie, who's now the assistant defence minister, was an SAS captain. He told a story about being pulled aside by a senior figure within the SAS and being told, a group of the junior officers going, I want you to be able to go out and shoot, I won't use the word, guys in the face, and then be able to dine with the ambassador at night. He's going, what are you trying to say? It was always crazy rhetoric. And talking to the SAS guys, their traditional role was to go out on, reconnaissance, surveillance, to not be said. They were a really important skill. That was skills they were really renowned for in Vietnam and in other conflicts like that. But then all of a sudden in about 2011, 2012, it changes to this American style, snake eater special forces crap where you go out and you kill, capture. And of course, there is a role for that for certain units, but the SAS sort of got caught up in all that. Now, you don't do that without the echelon, the top echelons allowing it. And if there's been a criticism of the Brereton report, and look, I think Brereton did a pretty decent job. He started off with vague rumours of, problems in Afghanistan and nothing specific. And, he got to the nub of it. But if there is a criticism that's been laid bare by others, is that the brass got away with it.
Mark, let's go back to the question of how widespread this was, because you made it very clear in the introduction to your book, and you've spoken about this just now, that your story, this particular story, Rogue Forces, is of one squadron on one rotation in 1 year in Afghanistan. How much are we to extrapolate from the kind of toxic culture that you describe out from that group into other areas of the special air force services? Yeah,
well, look, it wasn't just that squadron, that patrol that was involved in some of these unlawful killings and cover-ups, and the bullying and the bastardisation. Obviously, we've seen the reporting of Chris Masters, Nick McKenzie. We've seen the Brereton report. So we know that especially in 2012, things went off the rails. 2013, things were off the rails a bit. There was elements in multiple squadrons, not just the squadron I focus on in this book, that became toxic and led people down the wrong direction. So it was systemic. I think the early part of the Afghanistan campaign, I think things were generally okay, but we know from testimony to the Brereton inquiry from SAS personnel themselves that, things were not going well from 2006. And of course, there was the establishment of the bar in Afghanistan, the Fat Lady's Arms. And, I've talked to SAS guys go, well, we do a dangerous job. Why can't we blow a few beers back? Well, that's true, but I've also spoke to, Dusty Miller, who said he had the IV guys the next morning, so I've had some serious hangovers in my day. I'm a journalist, but I haven't had to be IV just yet.
I want to talk a little bit about the reaction to your work. You've been, as you mentioned, Chris Masters has done some work on this. Dan Oakes and Sam Clark have also done some reporting on this. The Sydney Morning Herald, of course, has reported on Ben Robert Smith. But you've also copped an awful lot of personal vitriol for the work that you've done. I think one person described you as the most treasonous Australian to ever walk the face of the earth. They argue, of course, that the SS was simply doing their job and that you are somehow undermining the reputation of a great and esteemed Australian military force. How do you feel about that? What's your response to that?
Look, if you get into journalism, as you know, you don't want to. You're not in it to win popularity contests. That's for sure. We're reviled for being, foot in the door merchants, and fat pills and all sorts of rubbish to investigative journalists who want to lift up rocks that the public don't want us to lift up. Look, I've got flack in the past for all sorts of stories. I've been a journalist for over 25 years. I've had the Israeli lobby up me, the Palestinian lobby up me when I was based in Jerusalem. I remember reporting on Fukushima and having the pro-nuclear lobby have a crack at me, even though I was just reporting on 3 nuclear meltdowns in the one nuclear plant. This, though, has sort of exposed what I would call sort of a nasty, uneducated side to some people. It has shown me that, look, as a journalist, I'm up for criticism, and I'll cop it. And if you want to read that book and put a 1-star rating on Booktopia, I don't care. But if you want to post rubbish on Instagram of you going into a bookshop and grabbing that book and hiding it in the fantasy section, good luck to you. It's a bit pathetic, but if that's what you want to do, that's fine. I'm all for free speech, but I'm also up there for good, solid debate. And, if I'm wrong, I'll put my hand up. And I've had to on occasion put my hand up.
One of the things that we discussed when we were preparing for this was the role of the media in all of this. And there's a tendency, I know, as journalists also to actually lionize and support the kind of mythology around the military, and particularly the special forces. There's been a backlash as well in the media for you as a result of this. How much do you think the media was complicit in creating the kind of mythology behind the SS?
Oh, look, there was certainly, it's amazing. These guys are amazing, mostly. They are highly trained. They are genuinely honourable, decent human beings. And I support the SAS as a unit and for its ideals. But having said that, we as the media, I think, have expectations of these guys, that they're superheroes, and certain elements of the media promote the fact that they are invulnerable, that they are, people who don't make mistakes and the public should never question them. Now, I've got mates who are SAS operators and they think that's a load of crap. They know that they should be held to a standard of accountability by virtue of who they are, by virtue of their training, by virtue of the creed that they uphold and the standards that they want to enforce upon themselves. And so, I think, I'm from the ABC, so I'm sort of some old lefty, I'm this pathetic sort of tree hugger, despite the fact that, my dad's a diesel mechanic from, Western Darling Downs, and so was his father. Just thought I'd throw that in there. So the media does have a big role to play in this mythology, but so do our politicians. I think one thing about the Brereton report that really sort of hit it home to me was that, the diggers are going to cop it, the diggers who did the wrong thing. Brass got away with it a bit. And Brereton never had the terms of reference to talk about the politics of Afghanistan. But, geez, they sent these guys back and back and back and back, right? And where's the culpability for our political masters? As always, they scoot in, your defence minister for a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, maybe if you're lucky, you go and you want to pin some medals on some guys, and those guys probably deserve it. But you want to get your photo taken. But when Brereton comes out, boom, where are you?
We'll come to, I really don't want to besmirch the entire SAS, and we will address that in a moment. But one of the things that emerged after, particularly after the Brereton report, was a debate around what was called the meritorious unit citation, the MUC, which was handed to all of some 3,000 members, I think it was, of the Special Operations Task Groups that were deployed, that served in Afghanistan. There was at the time, I think it was Angus Campbell recommended that the Governor General revoke the MUC. And that created a lot of debate at the time, which I know you think was a distraction, but it also highlighted a particular issue with the SAS, didn't it?
Yeah, look, it's a debate that's worthy of being had, but I just don't think immediately after a groundbreaking report into alleged Australian war crimes in Afghanistan that we should be talking about a collective award. Now, I won't dive into it too much, except to say that the SAS personnel that I spoke to, they didn't care about the MUC. In fact, one person I spoke to had already handed theirs back about 3 weeks before Brereton even submitted his report or became public. So the idea is it's a collective award, right? So to me and to others who I spoke to from within the regiment, it's really only as good as the weakest links within the collective. Now, I don't know, if we want to have a debate about the MUC as a country, I think we're missing the point. Let's have a debate about it down the track. Having said that, awards are important to people. I get that, but I don't know. I just sort of found it typically Australian response to a very serious issue. Well, let's argue about our declarations.
It strikes me that throughout all of this, there are two big issues, of course. There's the obvious question of unlawful killings, of murders of unarmed civilians. The Brereton report tackles that. But there's also the utterly predictable question of consequences, of the way that Afghans themselves responded to the killings. Now, as anybody who's operated in Afghanistan, the whole culture has a very efficient system of grapevine communications. They would have well and truly understood what was going on. In fact, I remember when I was working in Afghanistan, I heard rumours of what the Australians had been up to. I know that let me ask you, what kind of consequences do you think that had inside Afghanistan? You tell the story in particular of a relative of one of those that was killed.
Yeah, like you don't have to study counterinsurgency history from Sun Tzu or David Galula in Algeria or any of that sort of stuff to understand that if you go out and you wantonly kill people that you're not supposed to kill, in other words, civilians, then you're probably going to push people towards the insurgency. Right, okay, we all get that. We don't have to go to ADFA to understand that. So when I was researching for the book, the Killing Field section, which was the four corners where we saw the Afghan cowering on the ground with his red prayer beads, and then he's shot 3 times. And I have to say, the way he was shot, the soldier in question was looking around. He's looking around and he's sort of asking that guy and he's asking that guy. It was pretty poor soldiering. That's what was pointed out to me by a couple of SAS guys. And then he puts 3 bullets into this guy. So what do we think is going to happen next? Well, the Afghan elders of that village complained to the Australians, there's an inquiry done. The inquiry finds, no, the guy was running. He was 15 to 20 metres away. He had a radio. He was being tactically evasive or manoeuvring, so he was shot. Well, that's not what the video shows, of course. But the other impact, and this is sort of the sad impact for our troops and for our cause, is that guy's brother, Dad Muhammad, is the victim. He had a younger brother at the time who was about 13 or 14. His name was Jamshid. Now, as part of the book, I got my fixer to go and rustle up the family, find out who we could talk to, and there was Jamshid. Except Jamshid wasn't with the family anymore. So after that killing, he went off to try and join the Taliban. Now, the Taliban said to him, hey, boy, you're 14 or whatever, why don't you come back in a year or 2 or whatever? Well, Jamshid's got his blood up. Well, he does that. He comes back. So now he's what they call a Dago Mashar. which is like he's in charge of 40 to 50 men, and he's one of the commanders in Afghanistan, and he controlled some of the territory when I was sending fixers in to try and do stories. I didn't know that till I was writing the book. And so you think, well, cause, effect. It's, as one famous ABC cameraman said, it's not rocket surgery.
Before we open to audience questions, there is one more point that I think is really key here that's important to highlight. Your book is called Rogue Forces, and there are an awful lot of people who are involved in some pretty horrific activities. And we've talked about those, but they're also the heroes.
Mm.
Tell us who those people are.
Well, you know, in the book, these are the people who I believe uphold the values of the SAS and the Australian Defence Force more generally. They're the people who were shocked, stunned by what they saw, but to be honest, and they admitted, they didn't do anything at the time. They were too scared or they were too intimidated. They came home. Dusty Miller tells stories about basically drinking himself into oblivion, getting into punch-ups, going to work with a black eye. Tom, the SAS operator, talks about, you know, nearly assaulting a guy in a road rage incident and going off grid for 12 months. Christina tried to kill herself twice. You know, all these people came back and they suffered. And the one thing that I think the media has provided, and Brereton, is an outlet for these people. Now, we just don't give them an outlet. We check out what they have to say. But they're the tragedy, but they're also the heroes of what I think is this story. And again, I know that one good thing about this book is that since it's come out, a lot of people from within SAS and other parts of the Special Forces community have reached out to these people and sort of said, "You okay? Like, we didn't realise you were suffering." And then they got talking and they were suffering too. So, you know I've been attacked for this book and I'm quite prepared to cop that attack. What I won't cop is anyone sort of dismissing the courage of these people in the book. That really annoys me. And so, yeah, if people want to pull me up on factual errors, that's fine. But, you know, I do think the book, what I wanted to honour is the brave people that had the guts to speak out.
Let's take a few audience questions.
We've got one on Zoom to start with, actually.
I'll just read, we've got a few on Zoom, but we'll go to Zoom first and then the audience here. It's a question from Bob Bron. If, Mark, if you've endured this vitriol, what have the former SAS people endured?
Yeah, look, the vitriol I've got, I should be clear, has basically come on social media by what, you know, we call them keyboard cowards and whatever. It's in fact, I collect some of the best ones. I should read a couple. I brought them along. And then I'll get on to the real heroes. There was one guy, he said he used the book to get the fireplace going. So that's good. One used it to wipe something else. So they're very, I like this one. Imagine having the balls to put your name on a book of this nature, coward. Okay, that was a bit oxymoronic. And others, including one guy who won $285 on the pokies and said he went out and bought 9 copies and put them in the bin. Now, to me, that's water off the duck's back. But to be honest, none of the people in the book have copped anything from anyone. In fact, as I said in the last answer to Peter, they've had colleagues rally around them. So that's been one good thing to me. I've had anonymous trolls sort of come after me and say, you're the people in your book, they don't know what they're talking about, they're full of, you know what, but none of them directly, which is good.
Sure, some audience questions, yes.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for this. I'm really enjoying the book. Got a question, like the question that put in my head is whether it is a problem or just a few bad apples. And to be honest, like at the beginning of the book, you talk about the psychological tests the SAS have to, or the soldiers have to undertake in order to become SAS. And you mentioned that, or the psychologists mentioned that they have to take some of the traits of psychopaths to be eligible to be that. Like not all of them, but some of the traits. And then I'm thinking about the culture of cover up and the band of brothers that enable cover up and silence. But then I'm also thinking about the Australian public that it's just like doesn't want to hear the story. And then even going like more international, like the nature of the war in Afghanistan itself, where it's really difficult to tell apart civilians from soldiers, but also like the same people that were hunted by the NATO forces in Australia as well are now the people that are forming the government in Australia. So all of these things make me think that perhaps like the narrative of the bad apple, the few bad apples is just not credible or not enough, or
So the question is whether the focus on those bad apples is inadequate. We should be looking at some of the wider structural problems.
I think, yeah, like the narrative of the bad apple.
Yeah, look, there's definitely the bad apples, but the problem we had was the bad apples became, in some areas, dominant. And if a bad apple puts a bullet into someone that they shouldn't have put a bullet into, generally they do it in front of their patrol mates, then everyone becomes complicit. Also, obviously, there were some systemic problems with the leadership. So it had a ripple out effect. But, from a broader strategic point of view, well, what were we doing in Afghanistan after a certain point? And that's a political debate. It's a debate for everyone here to have. Because, I talked to some of these guys and they said, well, we really didn't know what the hell we're doing. There's this great quote. I think it's one of the great philosophical quotes. It's in one of the videos that I've got. And the SAS guys are standing around. They've been patrolling endlessly. There's been a bit of gunfire. And one guy just turns to the other, and this is 2012, he says, I don't think we're trying to win the war anymore. That's all he said. And I just think that was one of those poignant things I heard on those videos. And that came from a trooper. He's just a regular soldier doing his job, and that's what he thought.
Mark, can I just follow, just as a follow-up from that? There was one of the things that you talk about is the way in which those who objected, who felt deeply uncomfortable by what they saw, were made complicit because they were drawn into the deceit, even though they didn't want to. Can you just very quickly talk us through that?
Yeah, so Christina, she didn't have a frontline role. She was in charge of the imagery for a particular tour. So when patrols would come back, they'd submit the imagery that they'd taken, whether it's prisoners or bodies or compound locations, and she put the metadata next to it. And after that particular job where Dusty Miller has the patient taken away, who's later found dead, the senior sergeant, who is allegedly responsible, comes in, puts his hand on her shoulder and says, run me through the images. And they tick through the images a couple of times. He says, delete that one and delete that one. Now, that is enough to ripple out.
And critically, she's a part of the conspiracy.
That's right.
That's right. Even though she felt deeply uncomfortable with it, she's now committed a crime.
That's right.
Of conspiracy.
So that for that particular issue, you've got an SAS operator who allegedly kills someone, who's taken off SAS medic, who then implicates the woman or the officer or the soldier rather, who is in charge of the imagery. There is a later inquiry into that particular issue. Everyone covers up and goes behind this particular side. So it draws everyone in. And they're cleared until we run a story. And Brereton looks into it. And I can tell from Brereton's report, even though it's redacted, that that's one of the issues that has been recommended for further investigation by the federal police.
So let's have another question from Zoom.
Okay, so this is a question from Brooke. Have you had any reaction from the Afghan community in Australia?
I've had a couple of emails, there's one guy who used to work with the Australian, the Afghan Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission. I hadn't met him before he got in touch. He was quite chuffed with the fact that Afghans were being listened to because, there was one section of the book where they're investigating that particular killing I was just talking about, and the Special Operations Commander in Afghanistan decides, right, I'll meet with the locals and I'll hear them out. And he told Chris Masters in Chris Masters' book, these are big, tough, rough Afghan farmers, but they're probably Taliban. So he had a mindset. And while I was doing those stories, I get contacted by one of the inquiry officers who used to run these inquiries in Afghanistan into these particular issues that were brought to light. And he said, I couldn't believe that four corners. He said, I investigated that. And I said, oh, right. So you're one of the guys who cleared it. He went, yeah. He said, I think I was a schmuck. He said, I just didn't believe Australian soldiers could do that. So there's that preconceived notion, right, that Australian soldiers can't do that. Well, we're all human. We all cross lines. So, yeah, I think that sort of answers the question a bit.
We've got any more questions from the audience? So,
Yeah, Mark, congratulations on an incredible book. I take the book as a celebration of the bravery of those soldiers, the only soldiers who talked to you, who upheld their oath of office. And not only that, they have set with your writing an example to others who may be thinking, maybe this is the time when I've got to do the right thing. Thank you very much for a lovely book.
Thank you. And I should explain who this gentleman is. He's going to be embarrassed. But this bloke is Jim Slade, who helped Chris Masters. He was a police officer who helped Chris Masters blow the whistle that led to the Moonlight stage. Told him like this. Yeah.
all right, let's take the question from the lady in the floral dress.
Mark, and congratulations on the book too. You've spoken about obviously this toxic sort of explosion. Then we have this the wave of suicides that has come since Australia got involved in this war, suicides among veterans. I see something here, and then you said yourself, you quoted the patrolman who said, "I don't think we're here to win this." How much is that political sort of, I don't know, jape, this political sort of waltz in the park with no real understanding of what we're trying to do? How much is that responsible for both?
So for our Zoom audience, let me just repeat this. The question really is about how much our lack of political understanding and political will and political focus on this is on what we're actually trying to achieve in Afghanistan was responsible, I think, for the loss of direction and ultimately for what you've described in the book. Is that fair?
And also the suicides.
And the suicides and the mental health issues that we saw from a lot of people the veterans who came back deeply traumatized.
Yeah, I've spoken to special forces guys who were, there from 06, 07, all through to 2013, and by the end they were sort of struggling to understand largely what they were doing, and every time, for example, the SAS would hit a target and take out a target, or someone else would pop up. It was like sort of whack-a-mole. The commandos did good work on counter narcotics. There was good work done, don't get me wrong, but I think there was by the end of it, it was sort of just drifting. And so a lot of guys, they came back, and that's where the second battle began. And we have seen suicides, and suicides have easily outdone in terms of numbers what happened in Afghanistan. I see Heston Russell here tonight, and I know Heston's very passionate about that, and it's good to see that someone is. And there are a lot of people out there caring for veterans, and they need to be cared for. And in this book, again, I dealt with a couple of people who did try to end their lives. And, thankfully that didn't happen. They had good familial support. But again, I get angry about the politicians. I worked in Canberra for 2 years in Parliament House, and I could hardly wait to get out. They offered me a job in Jerusalem when they were blowing up cafes and buses. I said, yep, I'll go there. I sort of think the politicians always skate through, and a lot of people come home and suffer in silence and unfortunately are successful in attempting to take their life.
Right, we've got time for one more question from the audience.
Mark, thank you for a great book, and I certainly, it's been painful to confront from two generations of my family fought the First and Second World War. Two quick questions. One, this unlawful killing and atrocities, was it, you find the research, was it peculiar to the SAS, or was any evidence you came across of other Australian military units? Question two, in your wider research, did you find, when you may, I don't know if you did find, there were similar instances occurring in British and American Special Forces?
Okay, just for our Zoom audience, so two very brief questions. First of all, was what you found limited, do you think, just to the SAS within the Australian Defence Forces? And secondly, what you saw, were there echoes of this amongst other military forces that were working in Afghanistan?
Look, from what I saw, it tended to be the SAS. There was a problem. There's no doubt about it. There were rumours and obviously allegations about the commandos. They proved to be a bit harder to pin down. So, you know, from my perspective, the main people who contacted me were within the SAS who had issues about what happened over there. In regards to other forces, whether they're British or American, well, in the book, I do touch on a case involving the British Marines and the killing of a wounded Taliban fighter. And that was more to illustrate the fact that this guy, he ended up getting charged and convicted of murder, but then that was overturned because of something called adjustment disorder, which, you know, is a psychological condition. But certainly, you know, it's not something that's limited to Australians. We've seen war crimes committed, obviously, in conflicts throughout history by all sides. I think we're just humans, and I think, unfortunately, there was a quote in the book that I used. I think it was from Curtis LeMay, who the American general who ended up sort of ordering the atomic bombings in Japan in World War II, and he talked about all war as an atrocity, and you've really just got to get your head around that and move on, and that's the problem, isn't it? That's a pretty poignant grab.
I think that's all we have time for. Mark, thank you very much. It's been fantastic to have you here. It is a remarkable book, and personally, I hope that what we will see from your reporting from this book is a very serious, deep political discussion within Australia, not just about the behaviour of the SAS, but also about our political leadership that's led us into these kinds of conflicts. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Willacy, thank you very much.
Doing such a fantastic job. We had many more questions on Zoom. We didn't have time to get to them, I'm afraid. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming, particularly to people who came out despite the kind of uncertainty that we're having at the moment. And thank you also if you came on Zoom, that's fantastic. We are going to go to a signing app now. So people in real life here are going to be able to get their book signed. If you do want your book signed and you're not here in real life, you can just call the shop on 3846 3422, pay for it over the phone, and we can send it out to you as well. So what we're going to do to make this next bit happen more seamlessly is that we're going to get Mark out to his table before we all move out to line up. So we'll get Mark out through